Good afternoon. My name is Andrew Hairston, and I'm a staff attorney at Advancement Project's National Office. I'm honored to be your host for the Fall 2018 Pennsylvania Voter Protection Webinar, hosted by Advancement Project. Before I get into the substance of the presentation, I'd like to give a shout out to a number of organizations that are in collaboration with us on this project. In addition to Advancement Project, we have Unidos US, Race Forward, Demos, National Congress of American Indians, the National Urban League, the NAACP, and the Asian and Pacific Islander American Health Forum. We are a host of racial justice organizations that are partly funded by the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, which made this series possible. So we'll go ahead and get started. A little bit more about Advancement Project. Advancement Project is a national racial justice organization that uses legal communications and organizing strategies to build powers in community of color across the country, all with the goal of eliminating structural racism in the United States. And you can learn more about Advancement Project and our work at our website at advancementproject.org. The Advancement Project has a host of programs, one of which is the Power and Democracy program, of which I'm a member. The Power and Democracy program at Advancement Project is focused on removing barriers to access to the polls for Black and Brown communities and ensuring that Black and Brown communities have the ability to fully participate in American democracy. Again, my name is Andrew Hairston. I am a staff attorney at Advancement Project's National Office. And I'm only licensed to practice law in Louisiana, but this presentation was reviewed by a Pennsylvania barred attorney for general accuracy. Why do we vote? A very pressing and relevant question for the time in which we find ourselves, something that we should consider as this November 2018 election approaches and beyond. Certainly for Black and Brown communities in the United States, voting is an avenue for dignity, for achieving self-determination, particularly in the face of rampant racial discrimination of the past and the present, knowing that voting can provide an opportunity to shape the society in which we want to live, and honoring the legacy of those who came before us who fought so assiduously for the right to vote, and also recognizing the challenges that may exist ahead for generations yet to come. I want to highlight a quote from a Supreme Court case that was decided after the Civil War during what's called the Reconstruction era of American history. During this period, African Americans did gain some achievements in the areas of civic engagement and political participation. But there was also a significant backlash to those achievements. And perhaps it's because of this idea articulated in Yickwo versus Hopkins. Yickwo says, voting is regarded as a fundamental political right because it is preservative of all rights. By voting, we are able to influence policy related to education, to housing, to equal employment opportunities. Voting really does provide us with the opportunity to shape the society in which we live and hope for a better tomorrow. Also, why we vote? Again, to honor the legacies of those who have come before us, particularly those like the esteemed civil rights activist Bayard Rustin, who was a senior trusted counselor to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., an organizer of the March on Washington of 1963, and a native Pennsylvanian. So after all those years of struggle, after the period after slavery, going into Reconstruction, and then Jim Crow laws that popped up to limit the participation of Black people, particularly throughout the country, but Black and Brown people more holistically. There was a watershed moment that occurred in 1965 with the signing of the Voting Rights Act. President Lyndon Johnson signed this legislation into law to really enshrine protections into federal statutes that were initially contemplated by the Civil War amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, but never really given the teeth that they needed. And the Voting Rights Act really was a culmination of years of hard work of tireless advocates and organizers. Now, however, 53 years after the signing of the Voting Rights Act, there are many challenges that remain, particularly after the U.S. Supreme Court decided a case called Shelby County versus Holder in 2013. Many voter suppression laws popped up. In Shelby County, the court invalidated what was called the pre-clearance formula of the Voting Rights Act. So under this formula, states with a history of racial discrimination were required to petition the federal government or run changes to their election laws by the federal government before they could be approved. And again, Shelby County did away with this formula. And in its wake, a host of voter suppression methods took place. Strict voter ID laws were passed in various states throughout the country. There was elimination of early voting, and same-day registration in many spaces throughout the country. And we see these fights continually playing out in 2018. So all of that historical context in mind, we can get into the mechanics of voter registration in Pennsylvania and what's required ahead of Election Day, on Election Day, and even a little bit after Election Day. So registering to vote in Pennsylvania have several baseline requirements. One must be 18 years old by the time of the election on November 6th. They must be a resident of Pennsylvania, must be a U.S. citizen for at least 1 month before the election, must have been a resident of Pennsylvania for at least 30 days, and also must not be imprisoned and currently serving out a conviction for a felony. Now, it is very important to note that for Pennsylvanians on probation or parole in the state, and those who have returned to their communities from prison sentences are eligible to vote. How and where to register to vote. So there are a couple of options here. Pennsylvanians can go online to this website to register. They can also print out an application and submit it by mail. With this method, likely your last 4 digits of your Social Security number will be required. And once the form is completed, you can send it to your local board of elections, which can be found based on your county here. So once a Pennsylvania registers to vote, there are a few things to keep in mind about materials and deadlines. The county supervisor will mail a voter information card. Now, it's important to note with the voter ID requirements in Pennsylvania, if you vote before, you will not have to provide ID when you go to vote. But if you're a first-time voter, you will have to provide ID, and this voter information card can't be used as a form of ID. A couple of things to keep in mind about deadlines. There is a 30-day prior to the election deadline for registering to vote, and this translates to October 9th, 2018 for the November 2018 election. Once you have all of this information, you can verify your registration online by going to this website. You can also contact your local Board of Elections here to learn if you are indeed on the rolls in your county. So we understand that life happens and folks may have to move before Election Day. And we know that sudden moves can disproportionately impact folks of color. So we want to highlight this. If a voter moves to another county or within the same county before Election Day, they can update their address online at this link. However, this must be done before Election Day, 30 days prior, and that translates again to October 9th, 2018. Now, on to Election Day, with all of this information in mind about the pre-registration requirements. So again, as alluded to earlier, if you are A returning voter, you do not need to show ID when you vote in person, but if you are a first-time voter, you'll need to show a form of ID, which can take various forms, such as a state-issued ID card, like a driver's license or a PIN card. You also can use something issued by the federal government, like a U.S. passport, a student ID, or an employee ID, a utility bill, a paycheck, or a government check, all count as valid forms of voter ID in Pennsylvania if you're voting for the first time. Now, college students generally can vote in Pennsylvania. They just need to use the address either on campus or the address that they use to receive correspondence from the university. And college students must register to vote at least 30 days prior to an election. And college here is broadly construed or defined to include any accredited institution of higher education. So, election day hours and procedures. Polls will generally be open for 13 hours on election day from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. And if a voter is waiting in line at 8 p.m., they should still have an opportunity to cast a ballot, whether it is traditional or provisional, temporary. And we'll get into that more soon. Political activities are generally prohibited within 100 feet of a polling place entrance, and there will be markers in place to indicate where that 100 feet stretch begins. And to find your polling place, again, you can go to your local Board of Elections at this website. Now, assistance with voting at the polls. Pennsylvanians can request assistance from anyone, generally, with a few exceptions, an employer, an agency of the employer, a union representative if the Pennsylvania voter belongs to a union, or a candidate on the ballot in a voter's precinct or that local area where a person is voting. Now, at polling places throughout the state, accessible voting systems should be available. They will often take the form of Americans with Disabilities Act ADA compliant touchscreen devices. Now, if a Pennsylvanian has a permanent disability, there's also the option that they can apply for a permanent absentee ballot. Now, under Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, there are certain requirements for language assistance, and you can follow up with your local Board of Elections concerning whether language assistance can be made available if those certain circumstances are met. Now, if you would prefer not to vote in person, there is the option of an absentee ballot in Pennsylvania, which means not going to a polling place but mailing in your ballot. A Pennsylvania voter can fill out an absentee ballot application online at this link and then mail it to your local Board of Elections. It's important to keep in mind that the general deadline to request an absentee ballot is Tuesday, October 30th, 2018. And there is one thing I wanted to point out about this language assistance piece. It is required when there are more than 10,000 people or over 5% of the citizens of voting age in a jurisdiction or state who are members of a single language minority group. That's based on the Justice Department's requirements. Now, what happens if you're challenged at the polls? Under certain circumstances, a person may be challenged based on their eligibility to vote. Perhaps they might be in the wrong precinct based on the challenger's perception, or the person doesn't have a voter ID as a first-time voter. In the case of the latter situation, if you don't have an approved form of voter ID, you should still be allowed to cast what's called a provisional or temporary ballot. And if you find your eligibility being challenged, perhaps someone saying that you're in the wrong polling place, for example, you can consult with a poll worker at the precinct and cast a provisional ballot. If the challenge is unsuccessful, the provisional ballot should be counted as a regular one. If that person ultimately doesn't have basis to challenge you and it's without merit, your vote should and will be counted. A little bit more on provisional ballots. So if a first-time voter is required to vote by provisional ballot because they did not have a valid form of ID, they can learn if their provisional ballot was counted within 7 days of the election, November 13th, by visiting this link. And if someone challenges a voter's eligibility at the polls, the voter can produce a witness to affirm or confirm the voter's identity and residency. And if a challenged voter does not produce a witness, they'll have to vote by provisional ballot and then follow up with this same 7-day timeline that's expressed above. Now, being a poll worker, a concept that came up earlier in the presentation, is important. Poll workers must be registered voters, but they are paid positions. They play a critical role in ensuring fair election administration across Pennsylvania and in local precincts. Pennsylvania voters can learn more about becoming poll workers by contacting their local election official, again, at this website, votespa.com. Now, there's a very fine line between a challenge and voter intimidation. There are various forms that voter intimidation may take. It could be shouting at or directing abusive language toward a voter, repeatedly asking about a person's citizenship status, incessantly, constantly, lying about being an election official, and deliberately spreading misinformation about voting requirements, bringing a gun to a polling place, or posting misleading things on social media. So in that last situation, it could be that on Twitter, you may see a tweet that says that voters of one party vote on this day and voters of other parties vote on another day, which are falsehoods and can be a form of intimidation. Also, it's important to keep in mind that you might see police officers when you go to your polling place to vote, and these law enforcement officers should not hinder you from exercising your right to vote. Now, what to do when you encounter a form of voter intimidation, when perhaps a challenge wades into the line or past the line into voter intimidation territory. You can document the occurrence by taking notes if you have a pen and pad on you or your smartphone, or capture it with a picture. You can report the activity to a poll worker or the local board of elections. You can also report the intimidation to the National Election Protection Coalition, which AP, Advancement Project, is a member of. It is accessible through its website at 866ourvote.org, or you can call 866-687-8683. You can also consult with local advocacy organizations and poll managers to determine your next steps. So a few recommendations for strategic engagement ahead of the election. You can meet with your local board of elections at least 45 days prior to the election, and that period is fast approaching. You can also monitor voter purges. Now, there is a law signed into effect nearly 3 decades ago, a federal law called the National Voter Registration Act, that prohibits election officials from conducting mass purges of voters within 90 days of a federal general election, and we're within that period. So it could be that you go to verify voter information and you see that a host of folks in your community are not showing up on the roll, and you can use this information to see if your local board of elections has conducted a mass purge, which would be impermissible under this law. You can also encourage community members to sign up to become poll workers. Now, one point about the NVRA, there was recently a case decided called Husted versus A. Philip Randolph Institute by the U.S. Supreme Court during the October 2017 term that concerns the NVRA. Particularly, there was a process in effect in Ohio called the Ohio Supplemental Process that used a voter's inactivity as a trigger to remove the person from the rolls. Now, although the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Ohio Secretary of State in that case, the supplemental process at issue really concerned inactivity that would have led to removal after 6 years in Ohio. And so really the important thing to keep in mind is that the protections of the MVRA largely remain in place. So with all of this information in mind, there are a few final steps and concluding thoughts that I'd like to share. And this list of questions can be used during your meeting with your local board of election. 1, have you closed or consolidated any polling places? And where are those polling places located? How do you notify voters of these polling place changes? What are some of the common problems observed when processing voter registration applications? What happens if the registrant's information does not match the information in the state or federal database you use to verify identity? Under what circumstances will voters be removed from the voting rolls ahead of the November 2018 election? And how will voters be notified of emergency polling place changes on election day? A few more questions. How are voter registration applications processed if mailed before but received after the deadline? How you respond to poll workers and or challengers in the polling place who insist on improperly challenging voters? And if there is observed or there are observed problems at the polls on election day, is there a direct number that can be called to reach the local board of elections? A few other recommendations to get further involved. You can organize a community meeting, perhaps at a civic center or a church, to review registration deadlines and polling place changes. You can review requirements for registering voters to vote if you engage in that work, and consider becoming a poll worker for the election and encourage community members to become poll workers. At this point, we wanted to open up the floor for any questions that you all may have. Feel free to use the Q&A box. All right, we just want to thank you so much. If questions do come up, feel free to reach me at ahairston@advancementproject.org. You can also reach our office at 202-728-9557 and follow us on social media at ADV_project for updates on our voter protection work ahead of the November 2018 election. You can also visit nationalrighttovote.org for more information on power and democracy initiatives at AP, as well as voter protection work. I just wanted to offer one more disclaimer before we depart, that this was reviewed by a Pennsylvania Bar attorney, but it was not intended to be legal advice or to create an attorney-client relationship. It was solely based and meant to be based on general information and convey general information about the upcoming federal election. So with that, we just want to thank you again. We wish you all the best with your election efforts and voter protection efforts ahead of the November 2018 election, and take care.